So when the Spanish Empire gets to the Americas, they've got this massive problem on their hands. How do you control a whole new world and all the people in it? We're about to dive into the systems they created to do exactly that. Systems of labor, slavery, and social class that would completely change the Western Hemisphere for good.
Okay, this question really gets right to the heart of it. Just imagine you're an empire, and you've just landed in these enormous new territories. You've got millions of people, unbelievable resources. What's your next move? How do you actually keep control and, let's be honest, extract all that wealth? This was the huge puzzle the Spanish had to solve.
Well, their first thought was all about the money. The Spanish immediately saw all this incredible potential for wealth, silver from the mines, sugar from the plantations. But to turn that potential into actual cold hard cash, they needed one thing more than anything else, a giant workforce. And they needed it like yesterday.
So their first crack at solving this labor shortage was a system that actually got its start with Columbus and then just spread like wildfire through the colonies. It was called the encomienda system.
Okay, let's break this down, because the key here isn't just the land. The really crucial part of the encomienda was getting control over the people on the land. The Spanish crown would grant these prominent colonists called encomenderos not just territory, but entire communities of indigenous people to use as a forced labor supply.
So how do you possibly justify something like this? Well, the official story, the one the Spanish crown was telling, was all about religion. The idea was that the encomenderos were supposed to protect the native people and teach them about Christianity. But the reality on the ground? It was just brutal. That protection was really just a cover for what amounted to slave labor in the mines and on the plantations, whether they converted to Christianity or not.
But here's the thing. Even though this system was everywhere, it was basically built to fail. It was incredibly cruel, for sure, but it was also really fragile. And pretty soon, it started to completely fall apart.
There were two huge reasons why. First, and this is just devastating, was disease. Things like smallpox and measles, which were common in Europe, were completely new to the Americas. The native populations had zero immunity, and the death toll was catastrophic. Second, the indigenous people were on their home turf. They knew the land, the mountains, the forests, the escape routes, way better than the Spanish colonizers ever could. This made them a really unreliable workforce, because they could, and did, escape.
Okay, so the encomienda system is collapsing. Now the Spanish have a huge labor crisis. They're desperate for a new, reliable workforce, and they turn to a truly terrible solution, dramatically ramping up the transatlantic slave trade. Their thinking was as cruel as it was practical. They wanted people who they thought would be more resistant to European diseases and who, because they'd been taken across an entire ocean, would have absolutely no way to escape.
And this is how that terrible system fed itself. It was a vicious cycle. Europeans would set up trading posts on the African coast. And what was one of the most valuable things they had to trade for enslaved people? Guns. By giving firearms to some African groups, they gave them a massive military advantage, which just fueled more conflict and raids. It created this horrible feedback loop. More guns meant more captives, and more captives could be traded for even more guns.
To make a system this horrific work, you have to justify it somehow. And the way Europeans did this was, well, it was shocking. They took the biblical story of Noah and his son Ham and completely twisted it. They invented this idea, and I mean there is zero basis for this in the text, that Africans were descendants of Ham's cursed son, and that this curse gave them divine permission to enslave them. It was a complete fabrication to justify the unjustifiable. All right, so this leads to the next big problem for the Spanish. You now have three totally different groups of people living in the Americas: Europeans, Africans, and Native Americans. Spain needed a way to organize this new, complex, multiracial society. Their solution? To create an incredibly strict social hierarchy called the Caste system.
I mean, this is the question they're facing now. How do you hold on to power and create a predictable society when you have people from 3 different continents all in one place? Especially when mixing between these groups was creating whole new categories of people. How do you decide who gets rights, who gets power, and who has to do what?
Now, you'd think this was all about ideas of racial purity, right? And it was. But the main reason, the really practical driver behind it all, it was boring old bureaucracy. Specifically, taxes. The whole point of the hierarchy was to make it easy to figure out who paid what. In Spain's eyes, the lower you were on the social ladder, the more taxes you paid, and they needed a simple way to enforce that in the Americas. And this is exactly how they set it up. At the very, very top were the peninsulares, people born in Spain.
They held all the power. Right below them were the Criollos, people of pure Spanish blood but born in the Americas. Then came people of mixed ancestry, like mestizos and mulattoes, with all these different subcategories. And way down at the bottom, with the fewest rights and the heaviest tax burden, were Africans and Native Americans.
So what we've just walked through, this whole story, from the need for workers to this rigid social pyramid, it didn't just disappear when the colonial era ended. Not at all. Its legacy has been incredibly deep and long-lasting. You can think of it like this. These colonial systems became the very foundation for the new societies in the Americas. They basically set the rules for who would have wealth, who would have power, and who would have opportunity for hundreds of years. They baked deep inequalities right into the system. Inequalities we are still grappling with.
And that really leaves us with a big question for today. When we look at the world around us, at the social and economic problems we face, how much of that is an echo of these systems built centuries ago? By understanding this history of labor, slavery, and caste, what does it tell us about the inequalities that are still with us in our own time?